Hello everybody, this is Nobuo Haruna again. As I mentioned at the beginning of the previous lecture, I teach politics and international relations at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. In the second lecture, I will talk about economic growth and social transformation of Japan in the post-war era. Sometimes Japan is said that Japan is going through lost decades. To put it very simply, the meaning is that Japan has not experienced economic growth in the past 2 decades. And plus, well, as this magazine article suggests, the stock prices, Nikkei is the index for stock prices in Japan. The stock prices has also not increased, not grew since the 1990s. So, because of this economic stagnation, because of this recession in the economy with no growth, it is sometimes said that Japan is experiencing lost decades. In this lecture, I will talk first about the economic growth, so keizai seichou in Japanese, so that will be the first keyword of this lecture. The second one will be jinkou ido, meaning migration. I'll especially talk about domestic migration. The reason is because Japanese economic growth, especially since the 1950s to the early 1970s, was accompanied with a great domestic migration. So therefore, jinkou ido will be the second keyword of this lecture. The third one is, as I just mentioned, Japan today. Sometimes said that Japan is going through a lost decade or lost decades. And in Japanese, this is ushinawareta junen. So this will be the third keyword. I will divide this lecture into 3 parts, first starting with a brief overview of the trajectory of Japanese economy in the post-war era. So first, it's about the post-war economic fluctuations. Secondly, I will talk about economic growth and domestic migration. As I just mentioned, these 2 phenomena went on together at the same time. And so I would like to focus on the relationship between these 2 different phenomena. And the final part is about today, what is happening in the Japanese society during the lost decades, since the 1990s. So first, post-war economic fluctuations. Well, if you look at this chart right in front of you, this is showing you the annual GDP growth rate since 1955. As you can easily see, from 1955 to the early 1970s, so roughly speaking, it's around like 1973, until the first oil shock, which had a great impact throughout the world. So from the mid-1950s to the early 1970s, you can see that the annual GDP growth rate has been pretty high. It was about 10% in average for about 18 years or so. So that period is sometimes called the high-speed economic growth period, or in Japanese, Kodo Keizai Seichouki. Well, after that, if you look at European countries or the United States, well, especially the European countries, a lot of countries faced economic recessions for a pretty long time after the oil shocks in the 1970s. But as for Japan, Japan also suffered from the oil shocks. As you can see, in 1974, the GDP growth rate went into a minus for the very first time in the post-war era. But after that, you can see throughout the 1980s until the early 1990s, the GDP growth rate recovered, and it was around 4% in average from the mid-1970s to the early 1990s. Sometimes this period is called the stable growth period. But after that, from the early 1990s on, you can see that the annual GDP growth rate is sometimes slightly over 0, but sometimes way below 0. So you can see Japan is not going through economic growth anymore since the early 1990s. And that is why this period is sometimes called the lost decades. But before going into the lost decades, first let me start with the rapid economic growth period from the mid-1950s to the early 1990s. And as I mentioned earlier, this economic growth went together with the huge domestic migration at the same time. Right in front of you, this chart shows you the domestic migration that took place in Japan from the mid-1950s to the early 1970s. It is difficult to understand what this chart means, but to put it very simply, it shows you the number of people, the population that moved inside Japan from the rural areas to the urban areas. Well, in Japan, there are three huge metropolitan areas, huge urban areas. The first one is the Tokyo area, which is highlighted in blue. The second one is the Nagoya area in red, and the Osaka area in green. These are the three metropolitan areas. I believe you all know these three big cities, Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. Well, around these big cities, there are many actually middle and small-sized cities, and there is a huge population there. Well, and put this together, it's the yellow line, the three metropolitan areas. You can see in this chart, well, in the middle, in the horizontal bar, it's 0. And if you go above, it's plus, and if you go down, it's minus. So what this shows is that, to give you an example, in the early 1960s, you can see that the total number of people moving in to the three metropolitan areas is over 600,000 per year in the early 1960s. And where do they come from? They actually come from the other areas, so the non-metropolitan areas, or in other words, the rural parts of Japan. And so you can see in this same chart, you can see that the other areas, which is highlighted in purple, this is losing about more than 600,000 people annually in the early 1960s. So you can see there was a huge move of people from the rural areas of Japan into the urban areas, especially the three metropolitan areas in the 1960s. Well, or you can say starting in the mid-1950s and lasting until somewhere close to 1975. So this is actually the same period as Japan experienced high-speed economic growth, as I mentioned, from the mid-1950s to the early 1970s. So the economic growth was accompanied with domestic migration. This domestic migration transformed the society drastically. Well, to put it very simply, a lot of young people moved into big cities like Tokyo. And, well, the memory of this period is remembered by a lot of people, and it is also recorded in some literature or film works. And, well, right in front of you, I quoted this from a former Prime Minister of Japan in his book. He mentions about this, a huge hit of a film in the early 2000s. The film was titled Always Sunset on 3rd Street. Well, the setting of this film was inside Tokyo near the Tokyo Tower, and when it was under construction in 1958. So this is definitely the period when Japan was going through this domestic migration. And a lot of people moving in from the rural areas, especially from the Tohoku region into Tokyo. Well, to give you a very brief explanation of this movie, the protagonist, the main character of this film is a young girl from Aomori Prefecture in the northern part of Japan, moving into Tokyo in 1958. Her name was Mutsuko. In Japanese, it means, well, it's a Japanese name, and it means, in English, it means the 6th child. Well, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, Japan was going through a baby boom in the late 1940s. There were many families with 5 to 6 children. It's very realistic to have a 6th child in a family. Well, these children if they stay in the rural areas, the business for the family in those areas is mostly agriculture. But you can't have so many children succeeding that job of farming in the rural areas. So a lot of young children who cannot succeed their family business moved into the urban areas. And so one example was Mutsuko, moving into Tokyo from Aomori Prefecture in 1958. Well, there are a lot of people like this. And so that's why these movies will attract a lot of people, especially the people who experienced this period in the past. Well, and as I just mentioned, this migration definitely caused huge social transformation. You can see this in the transformation of the employment structure or the industry structure of Japan. Well, as the chart right in front of you shows you, in the early 1950s, about half of the population of the workers in Japan were engaged in farming, in agriculture. But you can see the percentage of workers in the industry of agriculture has been decreasing year by year pretty rapidly since the early 1950s on. And you can see manufacturing growing, wholesale and retail growing, and others, especially others in the service sector growing from the 1950s on. As I just mentioned a little earlier, people, when they stay in the rural areas, they will mostly, in many cases, they will engage in agriculture and farming. But when these young people move into the urban areas, they can't continue farming, so they get jobs in manufacturing, or in other words, in factories, or in some restaurants, shops, so that's wholesale and retail. And that's why we see a huge increase of these industries, manufacturing and wholesale and retail, starting from the mid-1950s. And this supported the growth of production in Japan from the mid-1950s. These young people moving from their rural areas into the urban areas, they also supported the growth of consumption in this country. If these young people, if they stayed with their families in the rural areas, then there will be no increase of households. But because these young people moved out of their parents' houses and came into Tokyo or Osaka and formed their own households, these big cities went through a rapid growth of households. So like this chart right in front of you, the green line shows you the increase of households inside Tokyo from 1950. So there are more and more newly born households in these urban areas, and which means that they had to consume more. If they stayed with their parents in the rural areas, there were some things that they didn't have to buy. But because they formed their own households in the urban areas, they had to buy new stuff. To put it very simply, like tools for cooking, and so on. And this contributed to a huge increase of consumption inside Japan. Well, especially right in front of you, I'm showing you the spread of consumer durables, especially electronic appliances from the 1960s on. You can see washing machines, refrigerators, color TV sets. These spread throughout the country in a very short period, starting from the early 1960s on. And as I just mentioned, it's not just about the speed of the spread, it's the number of how much these appliances were sold. If these young people stayed with their parents in the rural areas, that family can do with just one washing machine, just one refrigerator. Because of these young people coming into the urban areas, having their own independent households, they have to buy their own washing machine, their own refrigerator. So these electronic appliances sold miraculously well in the 1960s until the 1970s on. So with these young people moving from the rural areas to the urban areas, they contributed to the expansion of production in manufacturing and also they contributed to the consumption growth, especially of these electronic appliances. Well, but as I just mentioned a little while ago, the migration stopped in the early 1970s. Since then on, well, Japan continued to grow. The Japanese economy continued to grow. But since then on, from the mid-1970s, Japan started to depend more on exports. Well, this went well as well. As is well known, especially because this was after the oil shock, Japanese automobiles sold pretty well throughout the world and especially in the United States. Because Japanese automobiles were light and small, they didn't consume much gasoline, and that was suited for the world after the oil shock. So therefore, Japan made a success in exporting, and that contributed much to the continuing economic growth of Japan throughout the 1980s. But things changes from the 1990s. We entered the period of the lost decades since the early 1990s. Well, as I just mentioned a while ago, the GDP annual growth rate will be sometimes over zero, but sometimes way below zero. And to put it very simply, we can say that Japan virtually did not experience economic growth from the early 1990s on. What happened because of this stagnation of the economy is that employment opportunities shrunk. So, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the unemployment rate grew since the early 1990s on to the early 2000s for like a decade or so. The unemployment rate was over 4%, sometimes over 5%. And if you compare this number with the unemployment rate in earlier periods, like in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, you can see that this number of 5% was extremely high in post-war Japan. The unemployment rate was about 1% during the 1960s and 1970s, until the mid-1970s, during the high-speed economic growth period. So the unemployment rate grew, and plus the jobs to applicants ratio shrunk during this period. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, non-regular employment increased during this period as well. More and more people had to work with non-regular employment, which means, well, to give you an explanation of this, non-regular employment means everything else than regular employment. There is a definition of regular employment, and it consists of 3 conditions. The first one is a labor contract with no fixed term. So a non-regular employment means a labor contract with a fixed term, say 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, like that. The second condition is that the working hours are full-time. As for non-regular employment, especially for those part-time jobs, the working hours are not full-time, like 3 hours a day, 5 hours a day, like that. And they are paid by the hour. The third part is that the workers are, for regular employment, workers are directly employed by their employer. But in many cases, for non-regular employment, workers are dispatched from these temporary staff agencies. And in those cases, so the direct employer and the real employer is different. So therefore, that's a difference. That's another big difference between regular employment and non-regular employment. Well, so anyways, non-regular employment does not have these 3 conditions, and therefore, especially because of the first condition, the working status is very unstable. And because of the second condition, not working full-time, the payment, the remuneration will also be low compared to regular employment workers. So, but in Japan, especially from the early 1990s on, you can see that the percentage of workers working with non-regular employment contracts has been growing, which means that there were more and more workers with precarious employment status and low wages. But nowadays, it seems that as for employment, the situation is in recovery. It's getting better. And well, right in front of you, this is a chart showing you the job openings to applicants ratio of college university graduates. So this is especially for the young job seekers, the students who are seeking for jobs to get right after graduation. You can see for these young job seekers, the jobs to applicants ratio has recovered pretty much recently, especially in the 2010s. And nowadays, it's like 1.8, so which means that there's about 1.8 job offers for one job seeker. So the job seekers can choose their jobs nowadays. And this is pretty different from the situation in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. So therefore, as for the employment situation, especially for the young job seekers, we can see that the situation is in recovery. Probably the biggest reason for this is because of the population issue, as I explained in detail in the first lecture. Well, nowadays, if you look at this population period of 2015, you can see that the first baby boomers, the people who were born in the late 1940s, they have reached the age of 65. So nowadays, a lot of these baby boomers, they have reached the age of retirement, which means they left over a large vacancy in a lot of companies throughout Japan. And therefore, it's getting easier for the young people to get a job, to fill in these vacancies in many companies. Another great change inside Japanese society is that, because of this job shortage, as I mentioned, there are a lot of vacancies in many industries and many companies. Because of this job shortage, Japan is also experiencing an influx of workers from abroad. You can see that the increase of workers from abroad started to increase from the 1990s on. So, therefore, this is actually during the last decades. From the early 1990s on, Japan was actually experiencing a labor shortage. In that, especially in factories or construction works, there was a demand for workers, and this demand was filled by workers coming from abroad. Well, nowadays, this labor shortage is expanding into other industries as well. And so, therefore, we are witnessing a stable and a steady increase of workers from abroad taking place in Japan. And so, even during the last decades, it doesn't mean that nothing is changing in Japan. Things, even though the GDP growth rate is not going up, you can see that the employment situation is changing. And actually, we are seeing more and more workers coming into Japan from abroad. So that is all I have to say about economic growth and social transformation. Thank you very much for listening.